Joe Anthony Cruz is a senior Park Scholar at Ithaca College. While his major reads communication management design, he's been outspoken about social justice discussions and involved in initiatives to raise questions about what we know and what we don't. Activism is viewed as a series of opinion-driven actions and statements to some, but it's equally important to offer and understand unknown perspectives. Therefore, I visited Joe at Ithaca College for this next interview.
My name is Joe Anthony Cruz, known by the government, Patsnawahipu, known in Comanche lands. And I say that because my great-grandfather was Patsnawahipu.
Just very quickly, do you mind if I ask you, could you identify yourself? What perspective is it that you're bringing forward?
I identify ethnically or heritagely as Amerindian, an indigenous person to the land we call the United States of America, but also an indigenous person to the Southwest, a member of Aslan, Chicano, indigenous Chicano maybe is how, but I feel like that's redundant too, because Chicanx identity does tie in Indian blood. Not an immigrant. People often ask me to speak on behalf of all immigrants. I don't know that experience.
What would you say is the Kickstarter, the moment where you decided you needed to step forward and fight for something?
I think when I stepped into this whole role of like having a political existence was when I came out of the closet and had this homecoming, and less of a coming out, but a homecoming. Because immediately, not by my family, not by most of my family, but by some relatives and by some people here on campus, it became less so about my sexuality and my gender expression and more so about like, you're a person of power, think what this is gonna do, you're gonna be held back because you're gay, you're gonna be held back because you identify as a queer person. Like through talking with community organizers and activists, like it's much more, and doing my own homework on the LGBTQ plus liberation movement, it's much more my identity is about tying in that indigeneity, right? And having like indigenous people here and some of the Comanche and Cherokee, Navajo people, they believed in like the two spirits of everything. And if you were like a gender fluid, queer, I am a cis man, like I identify as man, which is like colonized thinking, but having the two spirits, right, of like female and male, you were balanced, you were perfect, you were this like sacred person because you could see both sides to things. I think that was like the first step into, and then being a Catholic that's gay, like it was very hard.
The key phrase is you do your homework. Where can someone go to sort of figure this out?
I'd like to say, because I'm a student in the media program and in data science, I like to say that I'm data informed and human driven is how I define myself. But I think it's much more about learning the story of your people, knowing that like even our white relatives have history beyond whiteness. Before you were white, you were, Bolshevik, or you were Jewish, or you were Irish or Scottish or Viking, whatever it is, right? So knowing your lineage, trace that back and really sit in the chair of your ancestors and like stand on your ancestors' shoulders and like understand where you lie on the spectrum of privilege. But also go on. I am a big proponent of like Google Scholar. I at least filtered through date. So a lot of the stuff on like the American Indian movement, which in the 60s was going on in the 70s, and like queer liberation, feminism, and like indigenous struggle, like that's all, again, like a lot on Google Scholar. But I'm also a person that spends so much time in libraries and museums and cultural centers.
And your own personal Instagram page was very active in the last couple of months. A lot of photos about you taking a visit to the U.S.-Mexico border. And what did you see? How did you feel some of these visuals that you were sharing to your audience?
I went twice. So the first time I went through the Latin American Studies minor department here at Ithaca College. And the second time, that was in November, for this convergence of movements called the School of the Americas Watch. And we kind of go down and like act as a watchdog, I guess, on like these training grounds where U.S. soldiers are training indigenous Guatemalan, El Salvadorian, Nicaraguan young boys, right, from the age of 13. Like imagine being taken from everything you know and placed in Decatur, Georgia, or Nogales, Arizona, and trained, right, to then go back into your own country and like fight your own people and like massacre and rape your women and children. Because that's what's going on. That's the state of our nation in 2019 and the state of those nations that we've, because of the Monroe Doctrine, felt the need to police, right, and to act as a big brother back in the 1800s when that was signed. My point is that I went in November to Border Encuentro, but then I also went most recently in January through the Park Scholarship, sponsored by the Park Foundation, to engage in this conversation about what immigration looks like and how people of the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona, how they navigate that. Because their reservation currently, the sovereign nation of Tohono O'odham, sits on the U.S.-Mexico border, and it is bisected. Half of their people live in Mexico, and half their people live in Sonora, and half the people live in Arizona. Because what I learned down there was like the term wetback has gone less so from Mexican, meaning Mexican, to meaning any kind of immigrant.
You're obviously learning a lot about these indigenous cultures, these grassroots efforts, but in at least the current system that is the U.S. government, in your experience with everyone that you were around, was there a conversation as to whether there needs to be a compromise when dealing with a system that is perhaps opposed to yours?
I think there's been compromises, but they've always been one-sided, because the Tohono people have never been at the discussion, at the decision-making table when it comes to, this is the materials we're going to use for the wall, this is how high the wall is going to stand, this is where the wall is going to cut your nation, your sovereign nation recognized by both the country, the Republic of Mexico, and the United States of America. Their people are literally just cut off physically from each other, but also physically from Congress and physically from, any decision, that's being made. And that's why going down there with people who are on a full ride to Ithaca College with immense privilege, myself included, even having this brown skin, it was really an interesting dynamic because I was welcomed by the natives. I was really taken in. And that's kind of what led this whole fueling of my work. It's being driven, it's continuing, right? This continuation of my work from Arizona was because a lot of the natives there, they were like, please continue to come and you're welcome here. And they gave me the ancestral land welcome and this and that. But they said, tell your friends though, we want them here, but we want them in Congress. We want them speaking across the aisle. We want them advocating for us, not because we're voiceless, but because the system has not the system is not made for us. The system is made to eliminate anything Indian, anything native. They were like, you really need to bring these issues to light.
This conflict about whose land does it belong to, and talk about borders dividing people, but also dividing land. You recently published an opinion article on the Ithaca, and before we went on the interview, you mentioned that some of it was cut off, perhaps even altered. What was sort of the inspiration to it, and what was the point that you wanted to get across in that article?
Yeah, it was altered. A lot of the way I described the founding fathers, meaning Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, I called them four gringos, and that was changed in the paper. A lot of this anti-white immigrant sentiment I didn't write that with anti-white immigrant sentiment. I wrote that with I grew up knowing that white people were just called gringos. That's how we talk in Texas, right? I think the point I wanted to get across was as long as we're on stolen land, which is where Cayuga Nation is currently, it was stolen from Cayuga, where Ithaca College and Cornell University sit currently, and most of the city of Ithaca and the town of Ithaca sit, we have to actively work to engage in conversations and in practices of decolonization and recognition of the Haudenosaunee people, of the 5 nations that were originally here, because then we're just blindly benefiting and ignorantly and arrogantly engaging in, again, the erasure of Native history and Native life, because people think that Native America people think it's ancient, natives don't exist today, but I really want to question a lot of my readers. Have you been to a reservation? Have you seen a reservation? Are you aware that we don't live in teepees? Reservations now are filled with mobile homes that they have to be self-sustaining. You see, gas tanks, because you're literally stranded. The government has sucked dry the resources of this land and made it so that people fall to the ailments of obesity and diabetes type 2 and alcoholism and sexual abuse and all these things that relate, yes, to white America and Appalachia and the mountain people of this area, but also one thing that got cut too was this idea of a lot of our struggles are rooted in the common evil. That common evil was what caused the Exodus with the Jews, and it was the plight that the black migration had to experience. A lot of the slavery talk, when I mix it in with pro-Palestine liberation and some kind of reminding my Jewish readers of their Exodus, sometimes that's really not received well by editors, and I think that's saying something. I think that's showing that I'm on the right track almost. If people want to silence me, then maybe it's because they know it's going to rile people up, and that's what I hope.
You graduated in May. You've accomplished a lot to at least engage in this conversation so far. What do you feel is left for you to accomplish, whether here at Ithaca College, in the Ithaca area, or in the next couple of years, wherever you end up after?
I really try to engage in mentorship as often as possible. And mentorship means different things. It's not like having like someone you get coffee with every, once a month kind of thing. For me, it's like using my privilege as a man for my female or women identifying peers that are younger than me or maybe on my same year who aren't invited to like certain lunches or who aren't invited. I bring them, I use that privilege, not that they need me to speak on their behalf, but oftentimes men in my fields of tech and media and politics, they leave women completely out of the conversation. Remind them of like, oh, the world is changing, like demographics are changing. Ithaca College is becoming more brown and black and women and female as we speak, and the same kind of conversation is happening at Cornell. I hoping to be this time next year in Geneva, Switzerland. Diplomacy has been something that's on my radar lately, like working for the United Nations would be amazing. However, I sit in this weird ambivalent state of like, is that my place? I just don't know if like right now would be the right time because I've been in a war zone. I've been to Nogales. I've been on both sides of Nogales, right? Mexico and the US. And I just know that like oftentimes like us going there feeds into this stereotype that there is a crisis, that there is an immigrant crisis, that the migrant caravan is being sensationalized. Like if I go, I want to go for the right reason. And so I kind of like, thinking like what's next for me, like getting engaged in local Texas politics, like where I'm from, like that might be the move. Like doing more like daily things instead of like this big showy, not that there's anything wrong with big showy things, but I'm just like, what is most, where could I realistically make the most change? It's something that I seek out is the stories of people in plight, but also like, do those people want their stories told?
If you'd like to further engage in discussion with Joe Anthony Cruz and his activism initiatives, you can contact him via email at jcruz@ithaca.edu.